Lena Han stood in front of the mirror, looking closely at the face that stared back at her, as though it had suddenly become a stranger. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. How long had she been seeing this? These wrinkles, these lines that weren't there yesterday, the pale under her eyes where there had once been only smoothness. She reached up to touch the small patch of gray near her right temple. How? She'd been working non-stop, too much time spent tinkering with her time experiments in the lab. But this didn't make sense. Time, in all its infinite, complicated mystery, shouldn't be able to reach inside her so directly. Her work with time manipulation was cutting-edge, revolutionary even. She should have been ahead of the curve, immune to the effects of natural aging, of time's unstoppable march. But now, staring at herself, Lena realized something: she was not immune to it. She was being consumed by it. No. No, no, no. Lena muttered, stepping back and rubbing her face with her hands as if she could wipe away the truth. It couldn't be happening. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The door to her lab clicked open, and Lena's assistant, Jake, poked his head in, a hint of concern coloring his features. Jake was young, a little scruffy, and always just a bit too eager to make light of things. Today, though, there was no room for his usual sarcastic humor. Lena? Jake's voice was softer than usual, cautious. You good? Lena didn't answer at first. She was too busy checking the reflection again. She wasn't imagining it. Her hair, once thick and dark, was thinning, strands falling out with every touch. The skin around her eyes, which had always been firm, was now sagging. She blinked, and the change felt like a punch in the gut. She closed her eyes, trying to push back the panic, but it surged forward again, like an electric shock. Time was unraveling her. But how? Her heart raced, and she turned abruptly, walking towards the lab door. Jake followed her, unsure whether he should be concerned or just give her space. He was good at the latter. Hey, Lena, hold on. Jake caught up with her, blocking her path with a frown. You're aging. The words stung more than she expected. It wasn't his fault. Jake was just saying what was clearly visible, but the accusation in his voice dug into her like a splinter of ice. She opened her mouth to argue, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing to explain. She was aging. I'm fine, Lena said, brushing past him. It's just stress. Too many late nights. I'll fix it. Let me work. Jake stood in the hallway, watching her as she retreated into her lab. She was already turning the dials, flipping switches, pulling data from her time experiments. She could feel the rhythmic hum of time pulse around her. Time wasn't the problem. It was her. It had to be. She was the constant. She was the variable. Lena knew her research wasn't perfect. Time was an elusive thing, a shifting mass of possibilities and probabilities that refused to be contained. But she had always believed, with quiet arrogance, that her work would be the key to mastering it. The idea that she could escape the aging process, or even reverse it, had been a hypothesis. Nothing more. But now, here she was, face to face with the consequences of that very ambition. Her body was deteriorating, and nothing in her lab could stop it. She checked the monitors, nothing unusual. The equations, the quantum simulations, all of it was running as expected. But somewhere beneath the cold, impassive numbers, she felt it. A pull. A pressure. Time was staring back at her, and it wasn't happy. The machine she had been working on, the one that had promised to manipulate time, hummed softly in the corner. She hadn't tested it completely. There were still variables she hadn't accounted for, things no one had ever accounted for. Lena had always been careful, always methodical. But the deeper she dug, the more she discovered that the very nature of time was beyond anyone's control. She had been so focused on trying to break the constraints of time, to manipulate its flow, to pause it, to bend it, that she had never thought about the consequences of being directly tied to it. Time wasn't something to be manipulated. Time was something she was. The truth hit her like a wave. Her life was the anchor of time. Her existence, her breath, her heartbeat, every passing moment, kept time flowing. And as her body aged, as her cells broke down, time was losing its anchor. If she didn't find a way to stop it, if she didn't find a way to fix the rift she had caused, then everything would break. Time itself might cease to move. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. But in the face of it, Lena couldn't stop herself from shaking. She collapsed into her chair, rubbing her hands over her face again, trying to steady her breath. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. She had worked too hard, too long. Her research was supposed to give her power, not this, but even as her mind raced with panic, the sense of knowing grew within her. She had always been good at seeing patterns. Time was not something she could outrun. It was something she had to learn to live within. Jake knocked quietly before entering. His face was etched with concern, though he tried to mask it with his usual, irreverent charm. "All right, Lena," Jake said, taking a seat across from her. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. I get it. But this whole aging thing, man, it's not just stress. You look older. You feel it too, don't you?" Lena looked up at him, her eyes wide with something almost close to panic. "Jake. I don't think it's just stress. I think I've become part of the flow of time. My body, my life, it's what keeps time moving. And if I stop, if I can't figure this out, time itself might stop." Jake blinked, trying to process the gravity of her words. Wait. So, what? You're, like, a living stopwatch?" "Not exactly," Lena muttered, rubbing her eyes again. "More like, I'm the key that makes time continue. Without me, everything might freeze." Later that evening, after Jake had left and Lena was alone in the quiet of the lab, she began to review the data. The readings were clear, and yet, there was something almost too neat about it. Her life force, her existence, was intertwined with the fabric of time. Every breath, every second she lived, was a stitch in the vast web that connected past, present, and future. But the more she aged, the more frayed that thread became. Lena's thoughts raced back to her father's journals. He had worked on similar projects before he died, projects she had barely understood at the time. He had written about time being a living thing, something that could be shaped, molded, but only if one truly understood its essence. Maybe, just maybe, her father's death had been a consequence of breaking time itself. Her breath caught in her throat. If her father had understood the dangers and tried to warn her, why had she ignored him? Was this fate catching up with her? Had she done something to herself? She was running out of time. The need to fix everything swelled inside her like a fire. Lena knew she couldn't run from this. She had to find a way to repair her bond with time, to prevent everything from collapsing. And to do that, she had to face the truth. She was part of time, not apart from it. Lena stood in front of her lab's central console, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she tried to focus on the task at hand. The flickering lights above her cast long shadows across the room. Her heart was racing, each beat a reminder that she was running out of time, literally. The same time she had once thought she could control, bend to her will, now seemed to be slipping through her fingers like sand. Her eyes tracked the flashing numbers on the display. Her physical deterioration was accelerating, more pronounced with each passing hour. Her breath quickened at the thought, but she pushed the panic down. Panic wouldn't help her now. Focus. It was the only thing that had ever worked. Lena had built her life on precision, on the belief that logic and reason could unravel the mysteries of the universe. Time was no exception. But now time was her enemy, a puzzle whose pieces had slipped out of her grasp. She keyed in the last command and hit enter. The machine hummed, the familiar vibration filling the air. Lena watched the monitor as a new set of data appeared. It was more of the same, nothing unexpected. Time wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to follow rules. She was supposed to be able to manipulate it, control it, make it hers. But this, what she was facing, was beyond control. It was a force of nature. A force she was now inextricably tied to. Lena swiveled in her chair and looked at the series of equations she had been developing for weeks. They were complex, abstract, filled with variables that she couldn't even fully understand. The intricacies of time, the quantum entanglements, the paradoxes, it had all seemed so clear when she had first set out to manipulate it. Now, it felt like she was staring at a maze, with no way out. She rubbed her eyes, trying to keep the exhaustion at bay. Focus. This wasn't about bending time anymore, it was about surviving it. The key is understanding the bond. Her father had warned her, had hinted at something that she had never fully grasped. He had worked on similar research, projects that strayed into dangerous territory, research that, according to the journals he left behind, could connect a person's life force directly to the flow of time. She was living proof of it. Lena's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She scrolled through the messages Jake had sent earlier, nothing urgent. He had tried calling a couple of times, his voice crackling through the speaker. But Lena hadn't picked up. She didn't have time to explain what was happening to her, not now. The clock was ticking, and she didn't even know if there was a way to fix what she'd broken. A sudden sharp pain shot through her chest, and Lena gasped, her body jerking forward. The coldness in her veins made her vision blur. Her heart was racing again, and for a brief moment, she thought she might collapse. She gripped the edge of the desk, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other. It's too much. But it wasn't. It was time. She was time. Or at least, she had become an anchor for it. A living tether that kept the past, present, and future from tearing apart. And now, as she felt her body give way to the strain of holding it all together, she realized what she had to do. Lena stood up, her legs shaky, and walked toward the time manipulation machine, her eyes locked on the blinking lights. It had to be this machine. This was her only chance. She wasn't sure what it would do, or what it might cost her, but it was the only way to fix what she had done. Her hands hovered over the controls, still unsure, still frightened. But there was no other choice. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath deep and slow. You've controlled time before. You've bent it to your will. This was no different, she reminded herself. This was simply another step, an experiment she had never anticipated. She couldn't fail now. Not when so much was at stake. Her fingers pressed the button. The machine hummed louder, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through her chest. The lights above flickered, the hum of the machine filling the space with a tangible pressure. Lena's heart raced, her body vibrating with the energy that surged through her. She could feel it now, the pull of time, like gravity itself pulling at her, demanding that she yield. The equations she had written, the formulas she had painstakingly developed, they were all coming together, connecting her to something far greater than she had ever anticipated. The air around her seemed to shimmer. She felt the weight of it all, her aging body, the years ticking away at an exponential rate, the vast ocean of time that stretched out before her. She was losing control. No. She wasn't losing control. She was becoming part of it. Lena gasped as she felt something shift inside her, like a switch flipping. Her eyes flew open, and the world around her seemed to warp. It wasn't just time she was manipulating now. She was inside time. Her heart raced as she realized she wasn't just observing it, or trying to control it. She was part of it, in every sense of the word. Her mind began to race, and the realization hit her like a hammer. This was it. This was what had been happening all along. She was the conduit. She was the anchor. Her life was the thread that wove time together. Without her, the delicate balance of the universe would unravel. Time itself was dying with her. The machine, the equations, it was all leading to this point. The pain in her chest intensified, and Lena staggered backward, clutching at her heart. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Was this the end? Was this how it would happen? Would time stop with her death? Would everything freeze, like a photograph taken at the wrong moment, suspended forever? Lena's vision blurred. Her body was crumbling. She could feel it, each second taking its toll. I have to fix this. Her father's journals flashed in her mind. He had understood, hadn't he? He had known that time was not just something to be controlled, but something to be respected. Her hands fumbled as she tried to stabilize the machine, to reverse whatever connection had formed between her and time. But the controls were unresponsive, the algorithms chaotic and unstable. She felt the world around her shift, as if it was slipping out of focus. No. And then, as if on instinct, Lena did something she hadn't planned on. She let go. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't try to control the flow of time or fight against the aging that consumed her. For the first time, she simply let it happen. Time had always been her adversary, her obsession, the thing she thought she could master. But in that moment, Lena understood. Time wasn't something to fight against. It was something to accept. She closed her eyes and exhaled, her body sinking into the rhythm of time, accepting it, feeling the flow of it within her. The pain in her chest ebbed, replaced by something else, something profound, peaceful. She felt herself dissolve into the flow of time, no longer separate from it, but part of it. She was not its master. She was its vessel. The machine powered down, its humming quieting, the lights flickering before going out completely. The room fell silent. Lena stood there for a moment, unsure if she was even still alive. Her body felt different, lighter, yet somehow more connected to the world around her. It was as if, by releasing her grip on time, she had become part of the very fabric of reality itself. A soft, steady breath escaped her lips. The clock on the wall ticked. Lena smiled. Time, at last, was not her enemy. Lena's eyes fluttered open. The air around her was thick, heavy, but it didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt alive. She could sense it, the constant hum of the world moving forward, the subtle pulse of existence carrying on despite everything. She blinked and exhaled slowly, but the weight in her chest, the strange burden that had been growing heavier each day, was gone. The coldness, the ache, the fear, it was all gone. She stood slowly, carefully, as if the ground beneath her was something she needed to relearn. The lab was silent, save for the faint hum of the cooling systems, the ticking of a clock on the far wall. The lights had dimmed, flickering in a way that felt deliberate. But Lena didn't feel the need to fix them. She didn't need to manipulate anything anymore. For the first time in years, there was peace. Her gaze drifted to the central console, the now still time machine, its screens black. She approached it, her steps quiet, almost reverent. She reached out, her fingers hovering above the buttons, unsure whether she wanted to touch it at all. The machine had been her obsession, her salvation, her undoing. But now, standing here, she saw it for what it was, a tool. One she had misused, one she had tried to control, but ultimately, it was just a part of the world around her. Lena breathed deeply, feeling the air fill her lungs, and for the first time in months, she felt fully present. What now? She thought of Jake. His texts, his calls. The concern in his voice when he had checked on her, asking if she was okay. She hadn't wanted to involve him. She had wanted to figure it out on her own, to solve it alone. But now, as she stood there in the stillness of the lab, the question seemed absurd. Her fingers found their way to her phone. She didn't know what to say to him, what could she say? That she had been running away from time itself? That she had nearly broken everything in the process? She didn't even know if he would believe her. But she had to tell him something. It's over. We're okay now. She tapped out a message, her fingers steady despite everything that had happened. She was not, she realized, afraid anymore. Not of the machine, not of her body, and certainly not of time. The phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Jake. "Lena, I'm coming over." She stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "I'm fine. I've figured it out." A pause. Then, the reply came. "You're scaring me." Lena smiled to herself, a brief, bittersweet curve of her lips. She had been scaring herself too. But now, as the reality of the situation settled over her, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic twist. Time had not bent to her will. It had simply been. And in the end, she had accepted it. The phone buzzed again. "Just tell me you're okay." Lena sat down at her desk, the weight of the machine still in the corner of her eye. She typed again, her fingers moving with a newfound calm. "I'm more than okay. I'm in sync." Jake's reply came quickly, almost too quickly. "In sync? What does that even mean?" Lena chuckled softly, shaking her head as she let the phone fall onto the desk. It didn't matter if he understood. He would. Eventually. Maybe not now, but when the time was right. When he could see that the world didn't need to be controlled. That time didn't need to be bent. It just needed to be understood. For a long moment, Lena sat there in the silence of the lab, feeling the quiet swell around her. She didn't know if the connection she had to time was permanent or temporary. It didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in a long time, she felt no urgency, no need to fix anything. She didn't need to push time forward, to manipulate it, to stop it. Time would flow whether she tried to control it or not. She felt the faintest ache in her bones, the familiar twinge that reminded her of her own mortality. It wasn't gone. She was still aging. Her body was still deteriorating. But that was okay. She could accept it now. She could accept herself, and the time that flowed through her, as it always had. Lena sat there for a while longer, her gaze fixed on the machine in the corner. The machine that had once been her key to the universe, to the mastery of time itself. Now, it was just a machine. A tool. A tool she no longer needed. The door opened, and Jake stepped in, his face drawn with concern. He took in the stillness of the room and the calmness that surrounded her. It was a moment before either of them spoke. "You're okay?" Jake asked quietly, his eyes searching her face as if he were looking for some sign of her previous panic. Lena smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made the weight in her chest ease just a little more. "I'm more than okay, Jake." Jake frowned, still unsure. "What happened? What's going on with you?" Lena shook her head, the questions and doubt still swirling in the back of her mind, but they felt distant now. She had the answers, just not the ones he was asking. "I think I've finally figured out what's been happening. It's not just the machine, Jake. It's me. My body, my life, it's tied to time itself." Jake's eyes widened, but there was no judgment in them. Just curiosity, and maybe a little fear. "So, what does that mean for you?" Lena stood up, feeling a surge of clarity that had eluded her for so long. She glanced at the machine one last time before turning back to him. "It means I've accepted it, Jake. I don't need to control time anymore. I'm part of it. We all are. And that's enough." Jake looked at her for a long moment, processing her words, then finally nodded. "I think I understand. Sort of." Lena chuckled softly, but the sound was full of warmth. You will. It's just something you have to feel. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lena felt the full weight of her own existence, not as a thing to be fixed, but as something precious, fragile, and real. She was part of something much larger than herself, something far more beautiful than she had ever imagined. Time was no longer an enemy. It was the rhythm of her heartbeat, the tick of the clock on the wall. It was her breath, her life, flowing forward into the unknown, and for the first time, she felt ready to let it all unfold.